The air inside the concrete basement of the Boston Historical Society always smelled of wet earth and decaying paper, a scent that 26-year-old Liam usually found comforting. It was nearly midnight on a stormy Friday, and he was completely alone, working the graveyard shift to catalog 19th century tax ledgers. His life in the city was painfully quiet, a monotonous routine of digital screens and empty apartments. He preferred the company of the dead. They didn't ask for anything, and they didn't leave when things got difficult. As the rain lashed violently against the high, narrow basement windows, Liam pulled a heavy, uncatalogued box from the bottom shelf. Inside was a single massive ledger bound in cracked black leather, held shut by a tarnished brass lock. Using a small screwdriver, he pried the latch open. It gave way with a sharp, metallic snap. As the cover fell open, a loose sheet of brittle, yellowed paper slipped out and landed on the desk. Written across the middle in dark, jagged ink was a single sentence. If you are reading this, do not look at the corners of the room when the clock strikes 3. Liam let out a dry chuckle. As a historian, his world was built on facts, data, and concrete evidence. He had no time for old superstitions or ghost stories designed to scare children. He tossed the note aside and turned to the first page of the ledger. The elegant handwriting belonged to Thomas Vance, a wealthy shipping merchant who, according to historical archives, had vanished completely along with his entire family during a winter storm in 1888. The early entries were mundane, detailing cargo weights, timber costs, and crew wages. But as Liam flipped deeper into the book, the neat script began to warp, turning into a frantic, chaotic scrawl that dragged heavily across the parchment. By the late October entries, Thomas Vance was no longer writing about his shipping business. He was writing about a presence in his home. "It begins in the periphery," one entry read, the ink heavily smeared as if the writer's hand had been shaking uncontrollably. "A thick, unnatural darkness that gathers in the corners of the room where the candlelight cannot reach." At first, you dismiss it. You tell yourself it is a trick of the eye, a shadow cast by the furniture. But then you notice the shape. It has too many angles. It stretches upward toward the ceiling, bending in ways that defy the laws of architecture. And it watches. Oh God, it watches. Liam leaned closer, completely captivated by the raw panic in the text. He turned the page. "My wife Eleanor saw it first in the nursery. She said the darkness was breathing, drawing all the warmth out of the room until her breath turned to mist. I did not believe her until tonight." I sat in my study, the grandfather clock ticking toward dawn. At exactly 3 o'clock, the fireplace died instantly. The room became an icebox. I looked to the far left corner. The shadow was there. It was a tall, skeletal silhouette, its limbs bent backward at horrific angles. It had no face, only a pale, hairless head that tilted toward me with a jerky, sickening motion. It whispered my name using my dead mother's voice. A sudden, sharp chill ran down Liam's spine. The air in the basement archives suddenly felt heavy and still. The distant rumble of the city traffic had vanished, leaving only the relentless drumming of the rain. He checked his watch. The glowing digital numbers read 2:54 a.m. He told himself to close the ledger, pack his backpack, and walk out to his car. It was just a diary of a man losing his mind to isolation. There was no reason for his heart to be hammering so violently against his ribs. Yet a morbid curiosity kept him pinned to the chair. He couldn't lift his eyes from the final page. The last entry was dated November 14th, 1888. The words were carved so deeply into the paper that the metal nib of the pen had torn through the sheets. "It has taken the servants. They walked into the dark corners and never came back. Eleanor went this morning." She walked straight into the shadow in the parlor, her eyes wide and blank, calling out to our deceased son. I am alone now. My candles are burning down to nothing. The clock is about to strike. If you find this ledger, do not read the words aloud. It looks for those who know of its existence. It feeds on your awareness. Once you know it is there, it can see you too. Liam stared at the final line, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. The silence in the basement was no longer peaceful. It felt alive, suffocating, and charged with an invisible current of malice. He exhaled, and a thick plume of white vapor drifted from his lips. The temperature in the room was plummeting. A sharp, mechanical beep broke the silence. Liam gasped, his body jerking in the chair. It was his digital watch. It was exactly 3 a.m. Instantly, the overhead fluorescent lights flickered violently, buzzing like angry insects before dying completely. The basement was plunged into a pitch-black void, save for the weak, pale glow of his phone screen on the desk. The cold was absolute now, making his teeth chatter uncontrollably. He reached out to grab his phone to use the flashlight, but the moment his fingers brushed the glass, the screen hissed. The battery percentage dropped from 90 to 0 in a fraction of a second, and the phone went dead. Liam sat frozen, his eyes wide with a primitive terror. He remembered the warning on the paper. Do not look at the corners. He kept his gaze locked strictly ahead, staring into the empty black space directly in front of his face. He tried to count his breaths to keep from losing his mind, but his lungs felt tight, as if the oxygen was being sucked out of the room by a vacuum. Then, from the far right corner of the basement, behind the rows of metal shelves, he heard it. It was a wet sliding sound, like a heavy piece of raw meat being dragged slowly across the concrete floor. Slidde. Click. Slidde. Click. The clicking sound was sharp and rhythmic, like the snapping of dry bones or long skeletal fingernails tapping against the stone wall. Liam squeezed his eyes shut, pressing his hands over his ears. It's not real, he whispered into the dark, his voice cracking with panic. It's just sensory deprivation. A psychological reaction to the book. There is nothing there. The sliding sound stopped. The silence returned, but it was closer now. The smell of old paper was suddenly replaced by a foul, overwhelming stench of stagnant water, wet earth, and rot. The air directly to his left stirred, a freezing breeze brushing against his exposed neck. Liam gripped the edges of the wooden table so hard his knuckles turned white. He could feel a massive presence standing just inches away from his chair, towering over him in the darkness. From the black space right beside his left ear, a voice broke the silence. It was not a monster's growl. It was the voice of his father, warm, clear, and comforting. A voice he hadn't heard since his father had passed away in a hospital room 5 years ago. Liam, the voice whispered gently, why are you sitting here all alone in the dark? Look at me, son. I've missed you so much. Just turn your head and look at me. A tear rolled down Liam's cheek, freezing against his skin. The temptation to turn his head was an almost physical force, pulling at his muscles, screaming at his brain to just look and see his father's face one last time. But beneath the warmth of the voice, he noticed a strange, hollow vibration. It sounded like two pieces of dry wood scraping together. It wasn't his father. It was a trap. No, Liam whimpered, keeping his eyes shut tight, pressing his chin hard against his chest. You're dead. You're not here. The voice instantly changed. The warmth vanished, replaced by a terrible, distorted chorus of a dozen different voices speaking in perfect unison. Men, women, and children all screaming through a single horrific throat. "Look at us!" the entity roared. The sound vibrated through the floorboards, shaking the metal shelves until the loose papers rattled. Liam felt long, freezing fingers, dry and rough like sandpaper, brush lightly against his jawline. The touch was so cold it burned his skin like dry ice. The fingers began to apply a slow, crushing pressure, forcing his head to turn toward the left corner of the room. Liam fought against it, his neck muscles straining, a desperate, silent cry rising in his throat. He could feel the entity's breath on his cheek, a foul, freezing draft that smelled of ancient graves. With a final, terrifying jerk, the entity forced Liam's head all the way to the left. His eyes flew open involuntarily. In the absolute darkness of the corner, the shadow was visible because it was darker than the night itself. It was a towering skeletal mass of shifting angles, its limbs bending backward and weaving together like the legs of a giant spider. It had no facial features except for two wide, hollow sockets that burned with a faint, oily green light. The creature's head sat low on its torso, tilting from side to side with a jerky, unnatural motion. As Liam stared in absolute horror, the entity's chest expanded, and it let out a low, rattling chuckle, the exact, mocking imitation of the dry laugh Liam had made when he first read the ledger. The long, blackened fingers reached out from the mass of shadows, wrapping completely around Liam's face and sealing his mouth before he could let out a scream. The cold rushed into his body, freezing his blood and turning his thoughts to ice. The darkness of the corner expanded outward like a massive wave, swallowing the desk, the chair, and the young historian whole, leaving nothing behind but the heavy black ledger resting quietly on the empty wooden table.